I never imagined burying my 5-year-old son while my husband was on a beach in Hawaii with his lover. No mother does. Yet there I was, standing in front of Kenny's tiny mahogany casket, his favorite dinosaur plush nestled beside him because he always said it kept the nightmares away. Nightmares. Something I couldn't protect him from in life. And now, something I couldn't save him from in death either. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The church was silent except for the soft sobs coming from the pews behind me. My mother's hand gripped my arm so tightly, it would probably leave bruises, but I barely felt it. The physical pain was nothing compared to the hollow ache expanding in my chest, threatening to consume me from the inside out. Everyone had come. Teachers from Kenny's preschool, neighbors, old college friends, everyone except the one person who should have been standing beside me. Evan. Willow, honey. It's time, my mother whispered, gently guiding me toward the front pew. I nodded mechanically, my body moving on autopilot while my mind remained frozen on the image that had greeted me just 30 minutes before I'd left for the funeral. I hadn't meant to check my phone. The funeral director had been going through last-minute details, and my phone had buzzed with what I assumed was another condolence message. Instead, what illuminated my screen was a photo from an unknown number. Evan, his arm wrapped around a woman I'd never seen before, both of them laughing on a pristine Hawaiian beach, cocktails in hand. The caption below read, "Thought you should know where your husband really is today. Someone who cares about the truth." For a moment, I couldn't process what I was seeing. Evan was supposed to be at an emergency conference in Chicago. That's what he'd told me when he explained why he'd have to miss Kenny's funeral. A last-minute work crisis that couldn't be rescheduled. I'd been too numb with grief to question. It too consumed by the loss of our son to wonder why he'd prioritize work over saying goodbye to Kenny. But there was no conference. There was only Evan, sunshine, and a woman who wasn't me. As I sat in the front pew, listening to the pastor speak, about Kenny's brave battle with leukemia, about his infectious laugh and kind heart, I felt something shift inside me. The crushing grief was still there, a weight I'd carry forever, but alongside it grew something else. A cold, clear anger that sharpened my senses and steadied my hands. My phone buzzed again in my purse. I shouldn't have looked. Not here, not now, but something compelled me to. A message from Evan. "Thinking of you and Kenny today. The conference is going well. Call you tonight." The lie was so casual, so effortless. Had there been other lies? How long had this been going on? I thought back to the past few months. Evan's late nights at the office, the weekend business trips that had become more frequent as Kenny's condition worsened, the way he'd seemed almost relieved when hospital visits gave him an excuse to be elsewhere. I'd attributed his distance to grief, to his own way of coping with our son's terminal diagnosis. I'd made excuses for him because I couldn't bear to face another loss. Now, I wondered if Kenny's illness had simply provided convenient cover for Evan's betrayal. "Would you like to say a few words?" the pastor asked, jolting me back to the present moment. The funeral. My son. The reason we were all here while Evan sipped cocktails in paradise. I rose slowly, tucking my phone away, and approached the podium. Looking out at the sea of sympathetic faces, I felt a strange calm descend over me. These people had come to support us, to support Kenny and me, because they cared. They weren't pretending. They weren't lying. "Kenny loved dinosaurs," I began, my voice steadier than I expected. "He believed they were still out there somewhere, hiding, waiting to be discovered. He'd tell anyone who would listen that when he grew up, he was going to find them all." A small, sad laugh rippled through the congregation. Even in the hospital, when the treatments made him so sick he could barely lift his head, he'd make me promise to read him just one more dinosaur fact before bed. As I spoke about my son, his courage, his imagination, his kindness. I felt his presence around me, supporting me when I should have been falling apart. I didn't mention Evan. This moment was about Kenny, not about my husband's betrayal. After the service, people gathered at my parents' house. I moved through the crowd like a ghost, accepting hugs and condolences with quiet thanks. Several people asked about Evan, their expressions a mixture of concern and curiosity. "Work emergency," I said simply, the lie tasting bitter on my tongue. I wouldn't expose his betrayal, not today. Today was for Kenny. My sister, Abigail, stayed close, running interference when conversations became too difficult. She'd flown in from Seattle as soon as she'd heard about Kenny's final turn, had been by my side through those last terrible days in the hospital. Unlike Evan, who had been too busy to spend the night, who had always found reasons to step out when the doctors delivered bad news. "You should eat something," Abigail said, pressing a plate into my hands. I couldn't remember when I'd last had a proper meal. Food had lost its taste weeks ago. "I'm not hungry," I replied, but took the plate anyway to appease her. "Mom's worried about you," she continued. "We all are." I looked at her then, really looked at her, and saw the question in her eyes. She knew something was wrong beyond the obvious grief. Abigail had always been perceptive. "Not now," I said quietly. "I can't. Not today." She nodded, understanding without needing the details. "Whatever it is, you're not alone, Willow. Remember that." As the afternoon wore on, people gradually departed, leaving just family. My father was in the kitchen, washing dishes with mechanical precision. My mother sat on the couch, leafing through a photo album of Kenny's short life. Abigail was on the phone in the hallway, speaking in hushed tones to her husband back in Seattle. I slipped out to the backyard, needing a moment alone. The swing set Kenny had loved stood silent in the corner, unused since his diagnosis had made him too weak to play. I sat on one of the swings, my feet dragging in the dirt below. My phone buzzed again. Another message from Evan. "How did it go? Wish I could have been there. Love you." The casual cruelty of it took my breath away. How dare he pretend to care? How dare he ask about a funeral he should have attended? And then another message arrived, this one from the same unknown number that had sent the photo. "There's more you should know. Not just Hawaii, not just today. Let me know when you're ready to hear it." I stared at the message, my mind racing. Who was this person? How did they know about Evan's betrayal? And what else was there to know? Part of me wanted to ignore it, to protect myself from further pain. But a stronger part, a part that had been awakened by the photo of Evan and his mystery woman, knew I couldn't hide from the truth anymore. Kenny had faced his illness with courage. I owed it to him, and to myself, to face whatever was coming, with the same strength. I typed a simple reply. "Tell me everything." The day after Kenny's funeral, I woke to an empty house. My parents had offered to let me stay with them, but I needed the solitude, needed to be surrounded by Kenny's things, his dinosaur collection lining the shelves, his drawings magnetized to the refrigerator, his tiny shoes still by the door. Each item was a knife to my heart, but they were also proof he had existed, that his short life had mattered. My phone chimed with a message notification. Evan again. "Landing in Chicago tonight. Can't wait to see you tomorrow. Been thinking about you and Kenny constantly." Chicago. The lies continued. I hadn't responded to his messages yesterday. Couldn't bring myself to engage with his fiction while my reality was so brutally different. But the unknown number, my mysterious informant, had been silent too, despite my request to know everything. Perhaps it had been a cruel prank, someone's idea of justice or revenge. I was making coffee when the doorbell rang. I wasn't expecting visitors, had specifically asked for space today. Through the peephole, I saw a woman I didn't recognize. Early 30s, auburn hair pulled back in a neat ponytail, dressed in jeans and a simple blouse. Something about her seemed vaguely familiar, though I couldn't place her. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Can I help you? I asked through the still chained door. Are you Willow? She asked. When I nodded, she continued. My name is Noelle. I'm the one who sent you the photo. I think we need to talk. My stomach dropped. The mysterious texter, here in person. I should have slammed the door, should have demanded she leave, but curiosity and that new cold anger propelled me forward. I unlatched the chain. You have 5 minutes, I said, leading her to the kitchen. I didn't offer coffee. Noelle sat at the table, her posture rigid, hands clasped in front of her. First, I'm sorry about your son, she said, and the sincerity in her voice surprised me. And I'm sorry to bring more pain, but you deserve to know the truth. Which is what, exactly? My voice sounded distant, detached, as if I were listening to someone else speak. Evan has been seeing my sister Anna for almost a year, Noelle said, meeting my gaze directly. I only found out recently, when Anna started talking about their future together once her divorce finalized. She mentioned you, how convenient it was that you were so distracted by your son's illness that you never questioned Evan's absences. The casual cruelty of it hit me like a physical blow. Kenny's illness, his suffering, his death, had been nothing but a convenient distraction. Why are you telling me this? I asked. Why send the photo? Because my sister is making a mistake, and because what Evan's doing to you is wrong, Noelle replied simply. Anna thinks he's going to leave you for her. She doesn't understand that she's just another in a pattern. Pattern? My mouth was dry, heart racing. Noelle reached into her bag and pulled out a manila folder. There have been others before Anna, at least 2 that I know of. But that's not the worst part. She slid the folder across the table. You should see these. Inside were printouts of bank statements, insurance documents, and what appeared to be mortgage papers. I stared at them, uncomprehending at first, then with growing horror as I began to understand. He's been moving money, Noelle explained, her voice gentle but firm. Draining your joint accounts in small amounts. And there's more. He took out a life insurance policy on Kenny 6 months after his diagnosis. Did you know that? I shook, my head numb. That doesn't make sense. Why would he? But even as I asked, I knew. The terrible truth crystallized in my mind with perfect clarity. The beneficiary? Evan only, Noelle confirmed. You're not listed anywhere on the policy. The kitchen seemed to tilt around me. I gripped the edge of the table, willing myself not to be sick. Kenny's death had been devastating enough. The loss of my beautiful, brave little boy after months of watching him suffer. But to think that Evan had seen it as an opportunity, had financially prepared for it while emotionally abandoning us both. There's something else, Noelle said, pulling out her phone. Anna has been posting about their trip. She pulled up a social media page and turned the screen toward me. Photos of Evan and a beautiful blonde woman filled the screen. Sunset beach walks, helicopter tours, intimate dinners. The captions made my blood boil. Starting our new life with my soulmate and finally free to be with the man I love. The timestamps showed the posts beginning the day before Kenny's death. They had already been in Hawaii while I sat by our son's hospital bed, holding his hand as he took his final breaths. Evan had claimed an emergency business trip that day, too. Why are you helping me? I finally asked, pushing the phone away. She's your sister. Noelle's expression hardened. Anna has always taken what she wants without considering the consequences. But this, she gestured at the documents, is beyond selfish. It's cruel. And Kenny was just a child. He deserved better. You both did. I nodded, unable to speak past the lump in my throat. There's one more thing you should know, Noelle continued. Evan and Anna are looking at property in Hawaii. They've been touring houses this week, expensive ones. I think they're planning to use the insurance money. The pieces clicked into place. The missing funds from our accounts, the life insurance policy. The future Evan was building while our son was dying. A future that didn't include me. What are you going to do? Noelle asked. I stared at the evidence spread across my kitchen table. The table where Kenny had eaten his breakfast, had colored. His dinosaur pictures had laughed and lived his short life. Rage and grief swirled inside me, threatening to pull me under. But beneath them, something else was forming. Resolve. First, I said, surprised by the steadiness in my voice. I'm going to call a lawyer, and then I'm going to make sure Evan never gets a penny of that insurance money. Noelle nodded, reaching into her bag again. I thought you might say that. I brought the name of someone who can help. She slid a business card across the table. George Miller. He specializes in cases like this. I've already spoken to him about your situation. He's expecting your call. I took the card, studying the embossed letters. Why go to this trouble for a stranger? Noelle's eyes met mine, and I saw something familiar in them. The same pain I felt, perhaps differently caused, but no less real. Because 2 years ago someone did this to me. They didn't warn me when they could have. I won't make the same mistake. As she stood to leave, I found myself reaching for her hand. Thank you, I said simply. She squeezed my fingers briefly. Don't thank me yet. The hard part is still coming. She glanced at the folder of evidence. When Evan finds out, you know. Let him come, I said, and for the first time since Kenny's diagnosis, I felt something like strength flowing through me. I'm not afraid anymore. What else can he take from me that he hasn't already tried to steal? I called George Miller that afternoon. His office was downtown, in one of those imposing glass buildings that always made me feel small and insignificant. But today, clutching Noelle's folder of evidence, I felt a strange new power coursing through me. Mrs. Harrington, George greeted me, rising from behind his desk. He was older than I'd expected, with silver hair and kind eyes that reminded me of my father. I'm very sorry about your son. The mention of Kenny sent a fresh wave of pain through me, but I pushed it aside. There would be time for grief later. Right now, I needed clarity. Noelle explained some of the situation, George continued, gesturing for me to sit. But I'd like to hear it from you, if you're up to it. So I told him everything, Kenny's diagnosis. 18 months ago, Evan's increasing absences, the life insurance policy I never knew existed, the photo from the funeral, and finally, the evidence Noelle had provided. George listened without interruption, taking occasional notes. When I finished, he leaned back in his chair, his expression grave. What Evan has done, is reprehensible, he said. But more importantly, much of it is illegal. Forging signatures, misappropriating joint assets, insurance fraud, these are serious offenses. What can we do? I asked, trying to keep the desperation from my voice. First, we protect what's left, George replied, his tone shifting from sympathetic to strategic. I'll file emergency orders to freeze your joint accounts and any assets in both your names. We'll need to move quickly before Evan returns and realizes you know. And the insurance money? If we can prove he took out the policy without your knowledge or consent, we can challenge the payout. The fact that he made himself sole beneficiary of a policy on your child will raise significant red flags with the insurance company. I nodded, feeling a small spark of hope for the first time in days. What do you need from me? Everything, George said simply. Bank statements, property deeds, communication records, anything that shows a pattern of deception or financial misconduct. I have access to our online accounts, I said, and his email is synced to the home computer. A flicker of caution crossed George's face. Be careful there. We need to document everything legally. No unauthorized access to his personal accounts. I thought of Evan's laptop, always password protected, always kept close. What about his personal computer? I'm sure there's evidence there, but I don't have the password. George considered this. Let's focus on what we can legally access for now. I'll also need a detailed timeline, when Kenny was diagnosed, when Evan's behavior changed, when these trips began. I spent the next hour going through every detail I could remember, George filling pages with notes. By the time we finished, a plan was taking shape. Methodical, legal, and devastating in its thoroughness. Evan returns tomorrow? George confirmed as our meeting concluded. I nodded. That's what he said, from his Chicago conference. Don't confront him, George advised. Act normal. We need time to secure these emergency orders before he realizes what's happening. The thought of facing Evan, of pretending I didn't know about his betrayal, made my stomach turn. But I understood the strategy. I can do that, I said, more confidently than I felt. One more thing, George added as I gathered my things. Do you have somewhere safe you can go if needed? A friend's house? A relative? The question caught me off guard. You think I'm in danger? George's expression was carefully neutral. People who find themselves cornered can behave unpredictably. Your parents' home, perhaps. I thought of my childhood bedroom, now a guest room, of my mother's worried eyes and my father's silent support. Yes, I said. I have somewhere. Back home, I began the process of gathering evidence. I logged into our joint bank accounts, downloading statements from the past 2 years. The pattern was clear once I knew to look for it. Small withdrawals, growing larger and more frequent as Kenny's condition worsened. In our shared cloud storage, I found travel itineraries carefully labeled as business conferences that matched dates of social media posts Noelle had shown me. Evan and Anna in San Diego, in Vail, in New York. Places he'd gone while I sat by Kenny's hospital bed, negotiated with insurance companies, and somehow kept our home running. The most damning evidence came from our home office. In a locked filing cabinet, the key to which I'd found years ago hidden predictably in Evan's sock drawer, I discovered a folder of property listings. Luxury homes in Hawaii's most exclusive neighborhoods, all well above what we could afford, on our salaries. I photographed everything, making copies where possible, scanning documents into a secure folder George had set up. Each piece of evidence was another nail in the coffin of the life I'd thought we had. As evening fell, I found myself in Kenny's room, sitting on his dinosaur print bedspread, surrounded by the toys he'd loved. The wall calendar still showed the month he died, with doctor's appointments and medication schedules carefully noted in my handwriting. I'm so sorry, Kenny, I whispered to the empty room. I should have seen it, should have known. But how could I have? Between the terror of Kenny's diagnosis, the grueling treatments, the faint hope followed by crushing disappointment each time, a new therapy failed. I'd had no capacity to question Evan's absences, his excuses, his growing emotional distance. I'd attributed his behavior to grief, to different coping mechanisms, to the strain Kenny's illness had put on our marriage. I'd made excuses for him because I couldn't bear to face another loss while watching my son slip away. My phone buzzed with a text from Evan. Just landed in Chicago, flight delayed. Can't wait to see you and sleep in our bed tomorrow night. Love you. I stared at the message, at the casual lie, at the declaration of love that now felt like ash in my mouth. Tomorrow he would return, expecting to find his grieving, unsuspecting wife. He would embrace me, tell me how sorry he was to have missed Kenny's funeral, perhaps even shed tears for the son he'd already discarded in favor of his new life. And I would pretend to believe him, would accept his comfort, would act as though my world was broken only by Kenny's death, and not by his betrayal. My phone buzzed again. Not Evan this time, but Noelle. "Are you okay? Did you meet with George?" The simple question of concern brought unexpected tears to my eyes. This stranger had shown me more honesty and support than my husband had in months. "Yes," I texted back. "We have a plan. Thank you again." "He'll probably try to turn it around on you," came her swift reply. "Make you doubt yourself. Don't let him." I thought of all the times Evan had done exactly that. Subtly questioned my memory, dismissed my concerns, made me feel unreasonable for needing his support during Kenny's illness. The pattern had been there all along, I just hadn't had the perspective to see it. "I won't," I promised, both to Noelle and to myself. "Not anymore." Setting down my phone, I reached for Kenny's favorite dinosaur plush, the one that had been his constant companion through hospital stays and painful treatments, the one duplicate I'd kept while the original rested with him. I held it to my chest, drawing strength from this tangible connection to my son. "I'll make this right," I whispered to Kenny's memory. "For both of us." Evan arrived home the next afternoon. I heard his key in the lock and forced myself to remain, seated at the kitchen table, where I'd been pretending to read a book for the past hour. My heart hammered against my ribs, but outwardly I appeared calm, another skill I'd perfected during Kenny's illness. "Willow?" His voice called from the entryway. I heard the thump of his suitcase, the rustle of his jacket being removed. "In the kitchen," I replied, surprised by how normal I sounded. He appeared in the doorway, his expression arranged in what I now recognized as practiced sympathy. Had it always been so obvious? This performance of concern? Of grief? "Hey," he said softly, approaching to kiss my forehead. I fought the urge to recoil. "How are you holding up?" "As well as can be expected," I answered truthfully. The double meaning was lost on him. He pulled out the chair across from me, reaching for my hands across the table. I let him take them, noting the subtle tan lines on his wrists where his watch had been while he soaked up the Hawaiian sun. "I'm so sorry I couldn't be there," he said, his eyes downcast in feigned remorse. The conference was impossible to reschedule. And with the company in such a precarious position— "I understand," I interrupted, unable to stomach any more lies. "Work is important." Relief flickered across his face. He'd expected resistance, perhaps tears or accusations about his absence. My acceptance made this easier for him, and that knowledge fueled the cold anger simmering beneath my composed exterior. "How was the service?" he asked, releasing my hands to pour himself a glass of water. "Beautiful," I said simply. "Everyone was there." "Everyone except me," he added, with what he clearly thought was appropriate self-recrimination. "I'll never forgive myself for missing it." I bit my tongue, literally, to keep from saying what I really thought. The metallic taste of blood filled my mouth, oddly grounding. "Are your parents still in town?" Evan continued, oblivious to my internal struggle. "They left this morning. Mom wanted to stay longer, but I told her I needed some space." The truth, for once. I couldn't risk my mother's perceptiveness. She would see through my act in seconds. Evan nodded, assuming my request for solitude would benefit his plans. "That's probably best. Time for us to grieve together, as a family." The word family from his lips nearly broke my composure. Our family was shattered, first by Kenny's death, then by Evan's betrayal. What remained was just hollow pretense. "Think I'll take a shower," he said, standing. "The flight was delayed, and I'm feeling pretty grimy." I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. As soon as I heard the bathroom door close and the shower start, I moved swiftly to his suitcase. The outer pocket held his travel documents, not from Chicago, but from Honolulu. I quickly photographed them with my phone, then checked the luggage tags. More evidence. Inside the main compartment, Beneath carefully folded clothes that smelled of unfamiliar laundry detergent, I found a small velvet box. My hands trembled as I opened it to reveal a diamond ring, not the modest one he'd given me years ago, but something ostentatious, flashy. A gift for Anna, no doubt. I heard the shower stop and hastily replaced everything, returning to my seat at the kitchen table just as Evan emerged, hair damp, dressed in clean clothes. "Feels better?" he said with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Are you hungry? I could order something." "Not really," I replied honestly. Food had been the last thing on my mind for days. "You need to eat, Willow," he admonished gently. "You look like you've lost weight." The concern might have touched me once. Now I recognized it as another performance, the caring husband, worried about his grieving wife. Just enough attention to maintain the facade, not enough to require real emotional investment. "Fine," I conceded. "Order whatever you want." While Evan called for delivery, I excused myself to use the bathroom, taking my phone with me. I texted George. "He's home." "Everything in place?" The response came quickly. "Emergency orders filed this morning. Hearing tomorrow at 9 a.m. Bank accounts frozen, insurance company notified of potential fraud. Stay calm." I deleted the exchange immediately, then washed my face with cold water, staring at my reflection in the mirror. The woman who looked back at me was pale, with dark circles under her eyes. But there was something else there, too. A determination that hadn't been present before. Through dinner, I maintained the charade, picking at my food while Evan talked about his fictional conference, inventing colleagues and presentations that had never existed. I nodded in the right places, asked appropriate questions, and watched him dig his grave deeper with each elaborate lie. "I was thinking," he said as we cleared the dishes, his tone carefully casual. "Maybe we should get away for a while. A change of scenery might help us both process everything." "Oh?" I kept my voice neutral. "Did you have somewhere in mind?" "Maybe Hawaii," he suggested, not meeting my eyes as he loaded the dishwasher. "Sunshine, beaches. It could be healing." The audacity nearly took my breath away. He wanted to take me to the very place where he'd betrayed me, perhaps to the same beaches where he'd walked with Anna, the same restaurants where they'd dined while planning their future with money stolen from our son's death. "That's an interesting idea," I managed, turning away so he wouldn't see my expression. "When were you thinking?" "Soon," he said, closing the dishwasher. "Maybe next week. I could look at flights tomorrow." "Let me think about it," I replied. "I'm not sure I'm ready to be around strangers yet." Evan nodded, accepting my hesitation as reasonable grief rather than the stalling tactic it was. "Of course, whenever you feel ready." That night, lying beside him in our bed, I kept to the far edge of the mattress, claiming I was restless and didn't want to disturb him. In reality, I couldn't bear his touch, couldn't stand the thought of his arms around me when they had so recently been around another woman. I waited until his breathing deepened into sleep before slipping from the bed. In the soft glow of my phone's flashlight, I crept to his suitcase again, retrieving the ring box. I photographed it from every angle, including the jeweler's mark inside, then searched the pockets of his discarded pants. His wallet yielded receipts from Hawaii, restaurants, tours, a jewelry store with a price that matched the ostentatious ring. I documented everything, then carefully replaced it all exactly as I'd found it. In the stillness of our living room, I sent the new evidence to George, then curled up on the couch, pulling Kenny's dinosaur plush to my chest. Tomorrow would bring the first real confrontation, not with Evan, but with the legal system that would ultimately expose his betrayal. As I drifted into uneasy sleep, I found myself wondering about Anna. Did she really believe Evan would leave? Me for her? Did she know about the others Noelle had mentioned? Or was she just another pawn in whatever game Evan was playing? A game where Kenny and I were simply obstacles to be removed. Morning would bring answers, but for now, I clung to the one truth I was certain of. Everything Evan had built on lies was about to come crashing down around him, and I would be there to watch it fall. I woke before Evan, my back stiff from a night on the couch. The sky outside was just beginning to lighten, casting our living room in gray shadows. For a moment, I lay still, listening to the quiet house, a quiet that once would have been broken by Kenny's early morning cartoons, his excited chatter about whatever dream had filled his sleep. The silence felt accusatory now. Empty. I checked my phone. 6:15 a.m. George's hearing was at 9:30. I had less than 3 hours to prepare myself, to maintain the pretense for just a little longer. In the kitchen, I made coffee, the familiar routine offering a strange comfort. I heard Evan stirring upstairs, the creak of our bedroom door, his footsteps on the stairs. "You're up early," he said, appearing in the doorway. His hair was tousled from sleep, his expression one of practiced concern. "Couldn't sleep?" I handed him a cup of coffee. "Not well," I admitted. At least that wasn't a lie. "You should have woken me," he said, reaching to touch my face. I allowed it, though his fingers felt like brands against my skin. "I'm worried about you, Willow." "I'm fine," I replied, stepping away under the pretense of refilling my cup. "Just processing everything." Evan nodded, assuming I meant Kenny's death rather than his betrayal. "I was thinking I might work from home today," he offered. "Keep you company." Panic fluttered in my chest. I needed to be at the courthouse. "Actually," I said carefully, "my mother called this morning. She forgot some things and wants to meet for coffee to pick them up." "I can come with you," he suggested, and I saw a calculation behind his helpfulness. He wanted to monitor me, to make sure I wasn't falling apart in ways that might interfere with his plans. "No need," I said lightly. "It'll just be a quick meeting. Besides, I'm sure you have work to catch up on after your conference." He hesitated, then nodded. "You're right. But call me if you need anything, okay?" "Of course," I promised. The lie easy after all his falsehoods. I showered and dressed with deliberate care, choosing clothes that made me look put together but appropriately subdued for a grieving mother. As I applied minimal makeup, I caught Evan watching me from the doorway of our bathroom. "You look nice," he commented, his tone suggesting surprise. "Mom thinks getting dressed helps with grief," I explained, which was true, though irrelevant to my current motivation. At 8:15, I gathered my purse and the folder of evidence I'd hidden, beneath Kenny's dinosaur books, a place Evan never ventured, even before our son's death. "I'll be back in a couple of hours," I told Evan, accepting his kiss on my cheek without flinching. "Don't worry about lunch. I'll probably eat with Mom." "Take your time," he said generously. "I'll be here when you get back." The irony of his statement, all the times he hadn't been there when I needed him, nearly made me laugh, a bitter sound I swallowed back. George was waiting outside the courthouse, his silver hair catching the morning sunlight. He wore a dark suit that somehow made him look both authoritative and kindly, like a professor rather than a lawyer. "You made it," he said, relief evident in his voice. "Any problems?" I shook my head. He suspects nothing. He even suggested a trip to Hawaii to help us heal. George's expression hardened. The audacity is almost impressive. Inside, we were directed to a small courtroom where a judge was hearing emergency petitions. Several cases were called before, ours, each brief and businesslike. When our turn came, George presented the evidence methodically. Bank records showing systematic withdrawal of funds, forged documents, the life insurance policy taken out without my knowledge or consent. The judge, a stern-faced woman with reading glasses perched on her nose, reviewed everything carefully before looking up at me. "Mrs. Harrington, were you aware of any of these financial arrangements?" "No, Your Honor," I answered, my voice steadier than I expected. "I knew nothing about the life insurance policy or the transfers from our joint accounts." She nodded, making a note. And your husband returns from Hawaii today? He returned yesterday, Your Honor, I clarified, though he claims he was in Chicago for a business conference. Something flickered across the judge's face. Disgust, perhaps, or simple human empathy. I see. She turned to George. The evidence is compelling, Mr. Miller. I'm granting the emergency orders as requested. All joint accounts will remain frozen, and the insurance payment will be held in escrow pending further investigation. Relief washed over me, so powerful that for a moment I couldn't speak. Additionally, the judge continued, I'm issuing a temporary restraining order preventing Mr. Harrington from disposing of any marital assets or removing property from your shared residence. Thank you, Your Honor, George said, his professional demeanor intact despite the victory. As we left the courtroom, my phone buzzed with a text from Evan. How's coffee with your mom? Miss you. The casual lie made my stomach turn. I showed the message to George, who shook his head in disbelief. What now? I asked as we descended the courthouse steps. Now, George said. We wait for him to discover the accounts are frozen. When he does, and he will, likely today, he'll realize his plans are in jeopardy. That's when things might get volatile. You think he'll become dangerous? The thought hadn't fully formed in my mind until now. I think people who've committed fraud and face exposure often react unpredictably, George answered carefully. Which is why we've requested the restraining order. It's not just about assets, it's about your safety. The weight of the situation settled over me anew. This wasn't just about money or betrayal anymore. It was about protection. Should I go home? I asked, suddenly uncertain. George considered this. Do you have somewhere else you can stay? I thought of my parents, but their home held too many memories of Kenny for me to face right now. My sister Abigail, she has a spare room. Call her, George advised. Pack a bag while Evan is still unaware and leave before he discovers the accounts are frozen. I nodded, the plan taking shape. What about Kenny's things? I can't leave them. We'll arrange for secure storage, George assured me. Right now, your safety is the priority. I called Abigail from the car, explaining, as much as I could without breaking down. Her response was immediate and fierce. That bastard, she hissed. Come straight here. The guest room is already made up. Next, I called my mother, briefly explaining that I needed her to corroborate my coffee story if Evan called. She asked no questions, sensing the urgency in my voice, promising only, whatever you need, honey. By the time I returned home, I had composed myself, slipping back into the role of grieving but coping widow. Evan was in the home office, the door partially closed. I could hear him on the phone, his voice low and urgent. What do you mean, frozen? He was saying. That's impossible. Check again. My heart raced. He'd discovered the first obstacle. Moving. Quickly but quietly, I went to our bedroom and retrieved the small suitcase I'd hidden in the back of my closet weeks ago, packed with essentials when Kenny's condition had worsened and hospital stays became frequent. I added a few more items, then moved to Kenny's room. His dinosaur plush, a photo album, the drawing he'd made in the hospital just days before he died. I took only what was irreplaceable, what I couldn't bear to lose. When I returned to our bedroom, Evan was standing in the doorway, his face a mask of barely controlled rage. What are you doing? He asked, his voice deceptively calm. I froze, the suitcase half hidden behind me. I thought I might stay with Abigail tonight, I said, the partial truth coming easily. I'm having trouble sleeping here. His eyes narrowed, taking in the suitcase, my rigid posture, the fear I couldn't quite disguise. What have you done, Willow? He asked softly, dangerously. What have you done? Evan repeated, taking a step into the bedroom. His voice was low, controlled, but I could see the tension in his jaw, the way his hands curled into fists at his sides. Nothing, I replied, struggling to keep my voice steady. I just need some space, Evan. Being in this house without Kenny? It's too much right now. He moved closer, his eyes never leaving mine. That's interesting timing, considering I just found out our accounts are frozen. All of them. His tone was conversational, almost pleasant, but there was an edge beneath it that raised the hair on the back of my neck. Frozen? I echoed, feigning confusion. What are you talking about? Don't play dumb, Willow. It doesn't suit you. He was only a few feet away now. Somehow, all our accounts have been locked down. The bank won't tell me why, only that there's a court order. A court order that must have been filed this morning, around the time you were supposedly having coffee with your mother. I took a step back, my legs pressing against the bed. Maybe it's a mistake, I suggested, knowing he wouldn't believe me, but needing to maintain the pretense a bit longer. Evan laughed, a harsh sound without humor. A mistake? Like the call I just got from the insurance company about a fraud investigation? Or the notification that our assets are under temporary restraining order? His voice rose with each question, the veneer of control slipping. What did you do, Willow? My heart pounded so loudly I was sure he could hear it. This was the moment I'd been preparing for, yet now that it was here, fear threatened to overwhelm me. Not fear of confrontation, but of Evan himself. This man I'd loved and trusted, who now seemed like a dangerous stranger. I know, Evan, I said finally, my voice quiet but firm. I know everything. He stilled, his expression unreadable. Know what exactly? Hawaii, I said, watching his face carefully. Anna, the life insurance policy on Kenny that you took out without telling me. The money you've been moving from our accounts. All of it. For a moment, he seemed genuinely surprised. Not that I knew, but that I had acted on the knowledge. Then his expression shifted, a calculating look replacing the anger. You're confused, Willow, he said, his tone softening, becoming concerned. Grief is making you paranoid. I was in Chicago for a conference. You can call my office, they'll confirm it. The gaslighting was so predictable it almost made me laugh. Stop lying, Evan. I have proof. Photographs of you in Hawaii with Anna, bank records, the insurance policy with only your name as beneficiary. It's over. Photographs? His composure slipped again. Who sent you photographs? Does it matter? I countered. The point is, I know, and now the courts know too. He ran a hand through his hair, pacing the small space between the door and where I stood. I could almost see his mind working, revising plans, calculating new angles. Willow, listen to me, he said finally, approaching me with his hands outstretched in a placating gesture. Whatever you think you know, it's not what it seems. Yes, I was in Hawaii, but it was a business trip that got rescheduled at the last minute. The conference in Chicago was canceled. And Anna? I asked, amazed at his ability to lie so fluently. The woman you were embracing on the beach while I buried our son. Was she a business associate too? His eyes hardened. You've been spying on me. And you've been planning to take the money from Kenny's life insurance and disappear with your girlfriend. I shot back, anger finally overcoming fear. Our son wasn't even cold in his grave, Evan. You don't understand, he insisted, changing. Tactics again. I've been under tremendous pressure. The business is struggling, our savings depleted from Kenny's medical bills. I needed to secure our future. Our future? I repeated incredulously. There is no our future in your plans, Evan. The house you were looking at in Hawaii, the ring in your suitcase, those weren't for me. He froze. You went through my things? Just like you went behind my back to take out an insurance policy. On our dying child, I countered. Seems fair. For a moment, we stared at each other across the bedroom, the room we'd shared for years, where we'd comforted each other after learning Kenny's diagnosis, where we'd held each other through nights of uncertainty and fear. Now it felt like a battlefield, the space between us charged with betrayal and rage. You've ruined everything, Evan said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. Do you understand that? Years of planning, all destroyed because you couldn't mind your own business. The casual cruelty of his words stunned me. Mind my own business? Kenny was my son. Our finances are my business. Our marriage was supposed to be a partnership. Partnership, he scoffed. You stopped being a partner when Kenny got sick. It was all about him all the time. Do you know what it's like to live with someone who only sees her sick child? Who has no time or energy for anything else? My hands trembled with fury. He was dying, Evan. Our little boy was dying. And you were worried about getting enough attention? I was worried about surviving, he shouted, his control finally shattering. About not drowning in medical debt, about having some kind of life after it was over. But you couldn't see past the hospital room, couldn't think about the future. The future I was thinking about was one where our son might live, I said, my voice breaking. While you were planning one where you could profit from his death. Evan's face flushed with anger. You self-righteous bitch. You think you're so perfect, so sacrificing. The devoted mother. Well, where did that get you? A dead kid and an empty house. The words hit like physical blows. I staggered back, my legs meeting the edge of the bed. Get out, I whispered, tears burning my eyes. Get out of this house. This is my house too, he snarled, advancing on me. And you've just frozen all my accounts, blocked my insurance payout? What exactly am I supposed to do now? That's not my problem, I said, finding strength in the cold anger that had sustained me since seeing that photograph. You made your choices, Evan. Now you get to live with the consequences. He moved so quickly I didn't have time to react. His hand closed around my upper arm, fingers digging painfully into my flesh. You think you've won? He hissed, his face inches from mine. But this isn't over, not by a long shot. Fear surged through me, but I refused to show it. Let go of me, I said evenly. Now. Or what? He challenged, tightening his grip. Or, I call the police and add assault to the charges against you, I replied. The restraining order the judge issued this morning doesn't just cover our assets, Evan. It covers me, too. He released me as if burned, stepping back. Restraining. Order? I rubbed my arm where his fingers had left marks. Did I forget to mention that part? You're legally prohibited from coming within 100 feet of me. So yes, you need to leave. Now. Disbelief washed over his face, followed by a calculating look I'd come to recognize. This is still my house. I have nowhere to go. You seemed to have plenty of places to stay when you were with Anna, I pointed out. Call her. I'm sure she'd be delighted to have you move in sooner than planned. His expression darkened. You've thought of everything, haven't you? I learned from the best, I replied coldly. You've been planning your escape for months. I've had days to plan mine, but unlike you, I had help. People who actually care about truth and justice. Like who? He demanded. I shook my head. That doesn't matter. What matters is that you need to leave, or I'm calling the police. Your choice. For a moment, I thought he might refuse, might escalate the confrontation further. But then something in his expression shifted. Not defeat, exactly, but a strategic retreat. Fine, he said tightly. I'll go. But this isn't over, Willow, not by a long shot. It is for me, I replied, the truth of the words settling over me like armor. I buried my son 4 days ago. I buried my marriage today. There's nothing left for you to take from me, Evan. He stared at me for a long moment, then turned and walked out of the bedroom. I listened to his footsteps on the stairs, heard him gathering his things in the front hall. The front door opened, then closed with a decisive slam that echoed through the empty house. Only then did I allow myself to sink onto the bed, my legs no longer able to support me. The confrontation had drained what little energy I had left. But beneath the exhaustion, a small spark of triumph glowed. I had faced him, I had stood my ground. And for the first time since Kenny's diagnosis, I felt like I was reclaiming control of my life. I called Abigail as soon as Evan left, my hands still trembling from the confrontation. "He knows," I told her, voice unsteady. "He's gone for now, but I don't think he'll stay away." "Come here immediately," she insisted. "Don't wait. Don't pack anything else. Just get in your car and drive." I followed her instructions, grabbing my half-packed suitcase and Kenny's precious belongings. As I locked the front door behind me, I felt a strange mixture of loss and liberation. The house had once been our sanctuary, the place where Kenny had taken his first steps, where we'd built a life. Now it felt tainted by Evan's betrayal, haunted not just by Kenny's absence but by the lies that had filled its rooms. Abigail was waiting on her front porch when I arrived, rushing to embrace me before I'd even closed my car door. "You're safe. Now," she murmured against my hair. "You're not alone in this." Her simple reassurance broke something in me. I collapsed into her arms, sobbing with a rawness I hadn't allowed myself since Kenny's diagnosis. These weren't just tears for my son, though his loss remained a gaping wound in my heart. They were tears for everything I'd discovered, for the life I'd thought was real but wasn't, for the betrayal that had compounded grief in ways I couldn't have imagined. Inside, Abigail made tea while I composed myself. Her home was bright and airy, so different from the oppressive silence of the house I'd shared with Evan. Photos lined her walls, family gatherings, vacations, moments of joy preserved in time. Among them were several of Kenny, his smile radiant, despite the illness that would eventually take him. "I didn't know if you'd want to see them," Abigail said, noticing my gaze on the photos. "I can take them down if it's too painful." "No," I said firmly. "Please don't. I want to see him. I need to remember him happy." She nodded, setting a steaming mug in front of me. "George called while you were on your way. He wanted to make sure you got out safely." "Evan was so angry, Abigail," I confessed. "I've never seen him like that. It was like the person I married never existed at all. Or he was always there, hiding behind the mask," she suggested gently. "People like Evan, they're good at showing you what you want to see. It doesn't mean everything was a lie, but it felt like it was. Every memory, every moment we'd shared now needed to be reevaluated through this new lens of understanding. Had he ever loved me? Had he ever truly loved Kenny? Or had we simply been convenient props in the life he'd constructed? Obstacles to be removed when they no longer served his purpose? My phone rang, interrupting my dark thoughts. Noelle's name flashed on the screen. "He's been calling Anna nonstop," she said without preamble when I answered. "He showed up at her apartment an hour ago, ranting about frozen accounts and restraining orders. She's freaking out." "Is she in danger?" I asked, surprised by my concern. For the woman who'd been with my husband while I buried our son. "No," Noelle replied. "She threw him out when he admitted the insurance money wasn't coming through. Apparently their love story had some financial conditions attached." A bitter laugh escaped me. "So much for soulmates." "Anna's always been practical about these things," Noelle said, a hint of dark humor in her voice. "When the beach house and luxury lifestyle disappeared, so did her devotion." After ending the call, I relayed the conversation to Abigail, who shook her head in disgust. "So his backup plan failed too," she mused. "He's getting desperate." "That's what worries me," I admitted. "Evan doesn't handle failure well." As if summoned by my words, my phone began buzzing with text messages. "You've destroyed everything. I deserve that money after everything I've been through. You had no right to interfere." I showed the messages to Abigail, whose expression hardened. "Forward these to George," she advised. "Document everything. If Evan violates the restraining order, even through texts, there will be consequences." I did as she suggested, then turned off my phone. I couldn't bear to see what else Evan might send. couldn't stomach more of his self-pitying rage. That evening, Abigail and I sat on her back porch, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and pink. For the first time in days, I felt myself breathing more easily, the vice grip of tension around my chest loosening slightly. "Do you remember that summer at the lake house?" Abigail asked suddenly. "When we were kids and Dad built us that rope swing." I nodded, the memory surfacing unexpectedly. "You were too scared to jump. You stood on the platform for almost an hour while everyone waited." "But you didn't pressure me," she recalled. "You just sat there with me, saying you'd wait as long as it took. When I finally jumped, you were right behind me." I smiled faintly at the memory. "You screamed the whole way down." "And came up laughing," Abigail finished. "That's who you are, Willow. You wait as long as it takes and you jump when it matters." She reached for my hand, squeezing it gently. "You jumped today. The landing might be rough, but I'm here to make sure you come up laughing again someday." Her words touched something deep within me, a reminder of the strength I'd always had but had somehow forgotten during the long months of Kenny's illness and Evan's growing betrayal. The next morning, George called with an update. The insurance company had launched a formal investigation into the policy Evan had taken out on Kenny. The evidence of fraud was substantial, especially given the forged signatures and the timing relative to Kenny's diagnosis. "There's something else," George added, his tone grave. "We've been looking more deeply into the financial records, and there's a pattern that's concerning." "What kind of pattern?" I asked, dread pooling in my stomach. "Regular payments to someone named Paula Winters," he explained. "They started about 6 months after Kenny was diagnosed and continued until recently." The name meant nothing to me. "Who is she?" "That's what we're trying to determine," George replied. "The amounts are significant. $1,000 transfers every month. At first, I thought it might be another romantic relationship, but the pattern doesn't fit." "Could it be related to Kenny's treatment?" I suggested. "Maybe some alternative therapy Evan was exploring without telling me?" "Possibly," George acknowledged. "But why hide it from you? And why continue the payments after Kenny passed away?" The questions lingered as we ended the call. Another mystery, another layer of deception to unravel. Would I ever know the full extent of Evan's betrayal? Later that day, Noelle called again. Her voice was tense, urgent. "Anna just told me something you need to know," she said without prelude. "About Evan and someone named Paula Winters." My breath caught. "I just heard that name this morning. Who is she?" "According to Anna, she's a nurse. She worked at the children's hospital where Kenny was treated." "A nurse?" I repeated, confused. Why would Evan be paying her thousands of dollars? There was a long pause before Noelle answered, her voice unnaturally controlled. "Anna says Evan told her the payments were to ensure certain information didn't come to light." "What information?" I demanded, a chill running through me. "Information about Kenny's medication," Noelle said carefully. "About dosages and timing." The world seemed to tilt around me. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying you need to talk to this Paula person," Noelle replied. "Immediately. Because if what Anna heard is true, Evan might have done something unforgivable." I clutched the phone, my knuckles white. Something worse than abandoning his dying son? Worse than trying to profit from his death? "Yes," Noelle said simply. "Much worse." Paula Winters lived in a modest apartment complex across town. After receiving her address from Noelle, I debated how to approach her. Should I call first? Show up unannounced? Involve George or the police? In the end, I decided direct confrontation was my only option. If what Noelle had implied was true, if Evan had somehow interfered with Kenny's treatment, I needed to know, no matter how devastating the truth might be. Abigail insisted on driving me. "You're in no condition to be behind the wheel," she said firmly. "Not after what Noelle told you." We sat in silence during the drive, the possibility too terrible to voice aloud. My mind raced with questions, with denials, with the desperate hope that this was all a misunderstanding. Evan might be capable of betrayal, of theft, of callous abandonment, but to harm his own son? It seemed unthinkable, yet the cold voice of reason whispered otherwise. The life insurance policy, the careful timing of his affair with Anna, the plans that depended on Kenny's death and the money it would bring. What if all of that had been more than opportunistic exploitation of tragedy? What if it had been by design? Paula's apartment was on the second floor of a well-maintained building. A small name placard beside her door confirmed we were in the right place. I hesitated, my hand raised to knock, suddenly terrified of what I might learn. "Do you want me to do it?" Abigail asked gently. I shook my head. "No, this is something I have to do." The woman who opened the door was in her early 40s, with tired eyes and brown hair pulled back in a practical ponytail. Recognition flickered across her face as she saw me. "Mrs. Harrington," she said, her voice carefully neutral. I wondered if you might come. "You know who I am," I stated, not a question. She nodded. "I was one of Kenny's nurses during his final weeks." Her gaze dropped. "Please, come in." The apartment was neat but sparsely furnished with few personal touches. No photos, no mementos. It felt like a temporary space, somewhere to sleep rather than a home. "I suppose you're here about the payments," Paula said, gesturing for us to sit at a small dining table. "Yes," I confirmed. "But more importantly, I'm here about my son, about what those payments were for." Paula folded her hands on the table, her knuckles white with tension. "I've been expecting this conversation since I heard about the investigation into your husband's finances. I just didn't think it would. Be you who came." "Tell me what happened," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. "Please." She took a deep breath. "It started about a year ago. Your husband approached me outside the hospital one day. He knew I was one of Kenny's regular nurses, and he said he had a proposition. He was direct about it. He offered me money in exchange for information, updates on Kenny's condition, copies of his charts, details about treatment protocols." "Why? Would he need that?" I asked, confused. "He had access to all that information as Kenny's father." "That's what I thought too at first," Paula replied. "I told him so, but he explained that he wanted to know things that weren't being shared with parents. Internal discussions between doctors, experimental options being considered, prognosis, assessments that might be too harsh to share with family." Abigail frowned. "And you agreed to this?" Paula's expression was pained. "I was behind on rent, facing eviction. The hospital pays poorly, and I have student loans. It seemed harmless. Enough. I wasn't changing any treatments, just reporting information." She paused. At least that's what I told myself. A cold weight settled in my stomach. But it didn't stay that way, did it? Paula's eyes met mine, filled with shame and regret. No. As Kenny's condition stabilized temporarily, Mr. Harrington became impatient. The questions changed. He wanted to know about medication interactions, about potential complications, about the margin of error in dosages. "Oh my God," Abigail whispered. "I didn't realize what he was planning," Paula continued, her voice barely audible. "Not until it was too late. The night Kenny took the turn that ultimately led to his death. Your husband was alone with him for several hours. You had gone home to shower and rest. Do you remember?" I nodded mechanically. Evan had insisted I take a break, had practically pushed me out the door, promising to call immediately if anything changed. When I returned, Kenny's condition had deteriorated dramatically. The doctors called it an unexpected complication, a risk they had warned might occur given the advanced stage of his cancer. "What did Evan do?" I asked, my voice a whisper. Paula's hands trembled. "I can't prove anything. I wasn't in the room. But he had asked very specific questions about Kenny's medication pump the day before, about how to adjust the settings, about how the nurses monitored dosage changes. The room seemed to spin around me. Are you saying he altered Kenny's medication? That he— I couldn't finish the sentence, the possibility too monstrous to voice. I don't know for certain, Paula said, her eyes filling with tears. But after that night, when Kenny's condition worsened so suddenly, Mr. Harrington stopped asking questions about treatments. Instead, he wanted to know about the death certificate. Who would sign it? What would be listed as cause of death? Whether there would be any kind of review? And you didn't report this? Abigail demanded, her voice sharp with anger. I was complicit by then, Paula admitted. I'd taken his money for months, and I had no proof, only suspicions and my own guilt. After Kenny died, your husband made one final payment, larger than the others, and said our arrangement was concluded. I sat in stunned silence, trying to absorb the enormity of what Paula was suggesting. Evan hadn't just abandoned us during Kenny's illness. He hadn't just tried to profit from our son's death. He might have actively hastened it, might have murdered our child for insurance money. I have records, Paula said quietly, rising to retrieve a small lockbox from a nearby bookshelf. Dates, amounts, notes about what information he requested. I kept them as protection, in case he ever tried to implicate me. She placed a folder on the table. Inside were meticulous notes, bank deposit slips, and even a few text messages printed out. I'm so sorry, she whispered. I should have come forward sooner. I was afraid and ashamed. I stared at the evidence before me, feeling as though I were looking at it from a great distance. Part of me wanted to deny it, to reject the possibility that Evan could have done something so unthinkable. But the pattern was clear. The timing of the insurance policy, the escalating questions. About medication, the final payment after Kenny's death. I need to take this to the police, I said finally, my voice hollow. And to Kenny's doctors. Paula nodded, tears streaming down her face. I know. I'll cooperate fully. Tell them everything I've told you. It's too late to save Kenny. But maybe it's not too late for justice. Justice. The word seemed inadequate for the crime Paula was describing. What punishment could possibly fit the deliberate killing of a child by his own father? As we gathered the evidence and prepared to leave, Paula touched my arm hesitantly. There's one more thing you should know, she said. Something I discovered after Kenny died. I was looking through his chart, trying to find anything unusual, any evidence of what might have happened that night. I steeled myself. What did you find? Kenny's cancer was showing signs of responding to the last treatment protocol. I said softly. The latest scan, taken just days before he died, showed a slight reduction in tumor size. The doctors were cautiously optimistic, planning to discuss potentially extending the trial if the trend continued. The implications hit me like a physical blow. Kenny might have had a chance. A small one, perhaps, but a chance nonetheless. And Evan, unwilling to wait, unwilling to risk the possibility of recovery that would render the insurance policy worthless, might have stolen that chance from him. I swayed on my feet, darkness edging my vision. Abigail's arm went around my shoulders, supporting me. Breathe, Willow, she commanded. Stay with me. Somehow, I made it to the car. Somehow, I found the strength to call George, to explain what we'd discovered, to set in motion the investigation that would either confirm or disprove the unthinkable. As Abigail drove us to the police station, I stared out the window at the ordinary world passing by. People shopping, walking dogs, living their lives untouched by the horror that had engulfed mine. The sky was a perfect blue, the sun shining as if it were any normal day. But nothing would ever be normal again. The betrayal I'd discovered went beyond anything I could have imagined, beyond grief, beyond rage, beyond comprehension. If what Paula suggested was true, Evan hadn't just betrayed our marriage. He had betrayed the most fundamental human bond, that between parent and child. and I had to find the strength to face this final, most devastating truth. Not just for myself, but for Kenny. For the justice he deserved. For the life he should have had the chance to live. The police station was cold and impersonal, the fluorescent lights harsh overhead as I recounted my story to Detective Jim Scott. He listened without interruption, his weathered face revealing nothing as I laid out the evidence. The insurance policy, the financial records, Paula's documented interactions with Evan, and the medical information suggesting Kenny's condition might have been improving before his sudden decline. "Mrs. Harrington," Detective Scott said when I finished, his voice gentle but professional, "these are extremely serious allegations. We'll need to conduct a thorough investigation, interviews with hospital staff, review of medical records, forensic financial analysis. It may take time." "I understand," I replied, my voice hollow. "But Kenny deserves justice, no matter how long it takes." George, who had met us at the station, placed a supportive hand on my shoulder. "Detective, given the nature of these allegations and the evidence already gathered, will you be pursuing Mr. Harrington immediately?" Detective Scott exchanged glances with his partner. "We'll be bringing him in for questioning today," he confirmed, "and we'll request a warrant to search your home and Mr. Harrington's personal devices." The thought of police combing through our house, Kenny's house, felt like another violation. But I nodded my agreement, willing to endure whatever was necessary to uncover the truth. "There's something else you should know," I added, pulling out my phone. "Evan has been sending threatening messages since I confronted him about the fraud." The detective reviewed the texts, his expression darkening. "This constitutes a violation of your restraining order. We'll add it to the charges." As we prepared to leave, Detective Scott handed me his card. "Call this number directly if he contacts you again, or if you feel unsafe in any way, day or night." Outside the police station, exhaustion hit me like a physical wave. The adrenaline that had carried me through Paula's revelations and the police interview drained away, leaving me trembling and hollow. "Let's get you back to my place," Abigail said, supporting me as we walked to the car. "You need rest." But rest seemed impossible. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Kenny in his hospital bed, tubes and monitors surrounding his small body. I heard his voice, weak but determined. "I'm getting better, Mommy. The dinosaurs told me so." Had he known somehow? Had his body been fighting back, finding strength just as Evan decided he couldn't wait any longer? The thought was unbearable. At Abigail's house, I tried to sleep, but found myself pacing instead, checking my phone compulsively for updates from George or Detective Scott. My mind kept returning to the night Kenny's condition had deteriorated, the night I'd left Evan alone with him at the hospital. I had been reluctant to go, but Evan had insisted, had practically pushed me out the door. "You need a shower and a real meal," he'd said, his tone concerned. "You've been here for 3 days straight. I've got this. Kenny and I will have some father-son time." Father-son time. The phrase, once innocent, now twisted into something sinister, in my memory. When I'd returned 4 hours later, Kenny was in critical condition, his breathing labored, his vital signs unstable. The medical team had rushed in, asking questions I couldn't answer about what had happened during my absence. Evan had seemed appropriately distraught, claiming Kenny had simply taken a sudden turn for the worse while napping. The doctors hadn't questioned it. Such rapid declines weren't uncommon in advanced cases. I had held Evan while he cried, comforting him even as my own heart shattered. Had those tears been real? Or had they been part of his performance? His carefully constructed facade of the grieving father? My phone rang, jolting me from the painful memories. It was Detective Scott. "Mrs. Harrington, we need you to come back to the station," he said without preamble. "We've been unable to locate your husband, and we need to review some additional information." "Unable to locate him?" I repeated, alarm rising. "What does that mean?" His phone is turned off. He's not at any of his known associates' addresses. And his car is missing from the hotel where he's been staying, Detective Scott explained. We're treating him as a person of interest who may be attempting to flee. I immediately thought of Hawaii, the property listings, the plans he'd made, with Anna. Have you checked airports? He was planning to move to Hawaii. We've flagged his passport and issued a bolo for his vehicle, the detective assured me. But we need your help identifying other places he might go, other resources he might have access to. Within the hour, I was back at the police station, sitting across from Detective Scott in a different interview room. This one felt more ominous, smaller, with recording equipment visibly set up. We've spoken with Dr. Michaels, Kenny's primary oncologist, he began, his tone carefully neutral. She's reviewed the medical records from the night in question and found several concerning elements. My heart pounded painfully in my chest. What elements? There was an adjustment to Kenny's pain medication pump approximately 2 hours after you left the hospital, he explained, consulting his notes. The adjustment wasn't logged by nursing staff, but the machine's internal memory recorded it. Could it have been a malfunction? I asked, clinging to any alternative explanation. Detective Scott shook his head. The machine requires a specific access code to modify dosages. According to hospital records, your husband requested and received that code earlier that day, claiming the night nurse had asked him to get it while she attended another patient. The room seemed to tilt around me. So, there's proof? Actual proof? That he... I couldn't finish the sentence. It's not conclusive yet, Detective Scott cautioned. But combined with the financial evidence, the insurance policy, and Ms. Winter's testimony, it's enough for us to issue an arrest warrant for Evan Harrington on suspicion of homicide. Homicide. The word hung in the air between us, stark and uncompromising. My husband, the father of my child, was now a fugitive wanted for killing our son. What happens now? I asked, my voice barely audible. We find him, Detective Scott said simply. Every law enforcement agency in the state has his description. His accounts are being monitored. His passport has been flagged. It's only a matter of time. But time felt like the one thing I didn't have. Each moment Evan remained free was another. Moment justice for Kenny was delayed. Another moment, the monster who had taken my child continued to evade accountability for his unthinkable crime. As I left the police station, a fine rain had begun to fall, matching my mood. Abigail waited, in the car, her face tight with concern. They've issued an arrest warrant, I told her as I slid into the passenger seat. But they can't find him. Abigail's hands tightened on the steering wheel. He can't hide forever, Willow. They'll find him. I nodded mechanically, staring out at the rain-slicked streets. Perhaps she was right. Perhaps the combined forces of law enforcement would locate Evan, would bring him to justice for what he'd done to Kenny. But a nagging doubt persisted. Evan had planned his betrayal meticulously. The insurance policy, the secret accounts, the relationship with Anna, the property. In Hawaii, what if his plans had included a contingency for discovery? What if he had prepared for this possibility, had created an escape route I knew nothing about? My phone chimed with a text message. Unknown number. My hand trembled as I opened it. You should have left well enough alone, Willow. Some truths aren't meant to be uncovered. Say goodbye to everything you have left. I showed the message to Abigail, who immediately pulled over and called Detective Scott. As she relayed the threat, I stared at the words, trying to decipher their meaning. Say goodbye to everything you have left. What did I have left? Kenny was gone. My marriage was revealed as a sham. The house held only painful memories now. Then it hit me. My parents. They had returned to their home after Kenny's funeral, were living their normal lives, unaware of the horror that had been uncovered. In their absence. We need to check on my parents, I said urgently as Abigail ended the call. Now. She didn't question me, just put the car in drive and headed toward my childhood home, pushing the speed limit. Detective Scott called back as we drove, confirming he was sending officers to my parents' address. "Don't approach the house if anything seems wrong," he instructed. "Wait for backup." But as we turned onto my parents' street, I knew we were too late. 2 police cars were already parked outside their modest home, lights flashing. An ambulance idled in the driveway, its back doors open. My heart stopped. "No," I whispered. "Please. No. Not them too." Abigail parked behind one of the police cruisers, and I was out of the car before she'd fully stopped, running toward the house, toward whatever new nightmare awaited. The sight that greeted me as I rushed toward my parents' house was chaotic. Police officers moving purposefully around the property. Neighbors gathered in small clusters on nearby lawns, their expressions a mixture of curiosity and concern. An officer intercepted me before I could reach the front door. "Ma'am, you can't go in there right now," he said firmly, placing a hand on my arm. "Those are my parents," I cried, trying to push past him. "I need to see them." "Willow." A familiar voice called my name, and I turned to see my father emerging from the house, his face pale, but very much alive. "Dad!" Relief crashed over me in a dizzying wave as I broke free from the officer and ran to embrace him. I was afraid." "I'm all right," he assured me, his arms tight around me. "But your mother—" His voice broke. Cold fear gripped me again. "What happened? Where is she?" "Paramedics are with her now," he said, gesturing toward the ambulance. "Evan was here. He broke in through the back door, demanding money, car keys, anything we could give him. When your mother confronted him, he pushed her. She fell and hit her head on the corner of the coffee table." "Is she—" I couldn't finish the question. "She's conscious," my father said quickly. "But they're worried about a concussion. They're taking her to Memorial Hospital for evaluation." I sagged against him, torn between relief that she was alive and fury at Evan for causing more harm to my family. Detective Scott approached, his expression grim. "Mr. Parker," he addressed my father, "we need a full statement from you about what happened here. And Mrs. Harrington, we need to talk about this latest development." As the paramedics wheeled my mother out on a stretcher, I rushed to her side. Her face was pale, a nasty bruise forming at her temple, but her eyes were open and aware. "Willow," she murmured, reaching for my hand. "Be careful. He's not himself anymore." "Don't worry about me," I told her, squeezing her fingers gently. "Just focus on getting better." "I'll ride with her to the hospital," my father said, following the paramedics. "Meet us there when you can." As the ambulance pulled away, Detective Scott guided me to his car. "Your father said Evan was looking for cash and transportation," he explained. "Classic fugitive behavior. Did he mention anything to your parents about where he might be headed?" I shook my head. "My father just said Evan was demanding money and car keys. Did he get either?" "Unfortunately, yes. Your father gave him about $600 from their emergency cash box and the keys to their second vehicle, a 2012 Toyota Camry. We've already added it to the BOLO." "He hurt my mother," I said, the reality of it sinking in fully. "He could have killed her, just like—" I stopped, unable to complete the thought that had formed. "Just like he killed Kenny." "We've upgraded the charges," Detective Scott confirmed. "Assault, breaking and entering, grand theft auto, in addition to the suspicion of homicide and fraud charges. When we find him, he's facing multiple life sentences. When, not if." The detective's confidence should have been reassuring, but all I felt was a hollow ache. More charges wouldn't bring Kenny back. They wouldn't erase the image of my mother lying injured on a stretcher. They wouldn't undo the devastation Evan had wrought on our lives. Why did he come here? I wondered aloud. He must have known we'd check on my parents after his threat. Desperation, Detective Scott replied simply. His accounts are frozen. His girlfriend has abandoned him. His carefully constructed escape plan is in ruins. He's improvising now. which makes him dangerous, but also more likely to make mistakes. At the hospital, I found my father in the waiting room outside the emergency department, his face lined with worry. "They're doing a CT scan," he explained when I sat beside him. "The doctor said it's precautionary, but they want to rule out any bleeding or swelling in her brain." I took his hand, noticing how it trembled slightly in mine. "She's tough, Dad. She'll be okay." He nodded, then turned to me with questions in his eyes. "Willow, what's happening?" Evan was like a man possessed, ranting about how you'd ruined everything, how you didn't understand what he'd been through. He mentioned Kenny's name several times, but it didn't make sense, the things he was saying. I hesitated, unsure how much to share. My parents had already endured the loss of their grandson. Did they need to know the horrific truth about how he had died? "Evan has been hiding things from me," I began carefully. "Financial things, mostly. He took out a life insurance policy on Kenny without my knowledge, made himself the sole beneficiary. When I discovered it and took legal action to freeze the accounts, he reacted badly. It wasn't the whole truth, but perhaps it was enough for now. My father didn't need the additional burden of knowing his grandson might have been murdered, while he was still waiting to learn if his wife would recover from her injuries." "I always thought there was something off about him," my father said quietly. "The way he distanced himself during Kenny's illness, the excuses he made to avoid hospital visits. Your mother said I was being unfair, that people handle grief differently. But it wasn't grief, was it? It was something else entirely." Before I could respond, a doctor appeared in the doorway. "Family of Paula Parker?" We both stood. "That's us," my father said anxiously. "I'm her husband, and this is our daughter." "Mrs. Parker has a moderate concussion," the doctor explained. "The CT scan showed some minor swelling but no bleeding, which is good news. We'll keep her overnight for observation, but barring any complications, she should be able to go home tomorrow." Relief flooded through me. At least in this, Evan had failed. He hadn't taken my mother from me, too. "Can we see her?" my father asked. "She's being moved to a room now," the doctor replied. "A nurse will come get you once she's settled." As the doctor left, Detective Scott approached, his expression suggesting new developments. "We've had a possible sighting of your father's Toyota heading east on Highway 16, he told me. State troopers are setting up roadblocks, but I wanted to ask, is there anywhere in that direction Evan might be headed? Any friends or family he might seek shelter with?" I thought for a moment, mentally mapping the area east of the city. His parents had a lake house about 2 hours east, near Pinewood. But they sold it years ago, after his father died. "Do you know who purchased it?" I shook my head. "Some developer, I think. Evan was bitter about it. He'd hoped to inherit the property." Detective Scott made a note. "We'll check property records, see if there's any connection. In the meantime, we're posting officers here at the hospital, and we'll arrange protection for your parents' home once your mother is discharged." The reality of our situation hit me anew. We needed police protection. Evan, the man I had married, the father of my child, had become so dangerous that law enforcement considered us at risk. How had we come to this? "Mrs. Harrington," Detective Scott added, his voice gentler, "I strongly recommend you don't return to your home or go anywhere alone until Evan is in custody. He's clearly targeting those close to you." I nodded numbly. "I'll stay with my sister or here with my parents." As Detective Scott left to coordinate with hospital security, my father and I were escorted to my mother's room. She lay in the hospital bed, looking smaller and more fragile than I'd ever seen her, a bandage covering the wound on her temple. "There's my girl," she said weakly when she saw me, extending her hand. I took it carefully, mindful of the IV line. "I'm so sorry, Mom. This is all because of me, because I uncovered what Evan was doing." "Don't you dare apologize," she said firmly, despite her condition. "You did what was right. Evan made his choices. Terrible, Cruel choices. The consequences are his to bear, not yours. As my mother spoke, I felt something shift inside me, the first stirrings of a different kind of strength. Not the desperate courage that had carried me through confronting Evan or the numb determination that had sustained me through police interviews, but something steadier, more resolute. Evan had taken so much from me: my son, my marriage, my sense of security, and now, nearly my mother as well. But he hadn't taken everything. I still had family who loved me, still had the truth on my side, still had the capacity to rebuild from the ashes he'd left behind. "We'll get through this," I said, as much to myself as to my parents. "Somehow, we'll find a way forward." My mother's eyes, tired but clear, met mine. "Of course we will. Parker women don't break, Willow. We bend, we hurt, we cry, but we don't break." 2 days passed with no sign of Evan. My mother was released from the hospital, her concussion deemed mild enough. For home recovery, the three of us stayed at Abigail's house, my parents in the guest room, me on the sofa bed, while police maintained regular patrols past my parents' home and my former house with Evan. On the third morning, as we gathered in Abigail's kitchen, for a subdued breakfast, Detective Scott called. "We've tracked the Toyota to a motel just outside Pinewood," he reported. "Local officers confirmed it's your father's vehicle, but Evan appears to have abandoned it. We believe he may have switched to another car." "He's still in Pinewood?" I asked, thinking of the lake house his family had once owned. "We believe so. We've been checking property records as you suggested, and there's something interesting. The developer who bought the lake house from your in-laws went bankrupt 3 years ago. The property was divided and resold, but one cabin remained unsold. Care to guess who purchased it through a shell company?" My breath caught. "Evan? A corporation called K&W Holdings. We've traced it back to your husband. The purchase was made about 8 months ago, right around the time Kenny's prognosis worsened. The timing was unmistakable. As our son's condition deteriorated, as the doctors began discussing hospice options rather than treatment, Evan had been preparing his escape route. "Are you searching the cabin?" I asked. "We have officers approaching now, using caution. I'll update you as soon as we know more." After hanging up, I relayed the information to my family. My father's expression darkened with anger, while my mother simply shook her head in disbelief. "He was planning this all along," Abigail said, voicing what we were all thinking. "Even before Kenny died, he was setting up his getaway." The thought made me physically ill. While I had been at Kenny's bedside, reading him dinosaur stories and helping him through painful treatments, Evan had been orchestrating his exit strategy, one that apparently included hastening our son's death to collect insurance money. Hours crawled by with no further updates. The waiting was excruciating, each minute stretching like an hour. I found myself jumping at every sound, checking my phone compulsively for missed calls or messages. Finally, just after 2 p.m., Detective Scott called again. "We found evidence that Evan was at the cabin recently, food wrappers, disturbed bedding, but he wasn't there when officers arrived. However, we did find something you should see. I'm texting you a photo now." My phone chimed with an incoming message. I opened it to find an image of a wall in what appeared to be a small cabin. Pinned to the wall was a map with routes marked in red, surrounding areas highlighted in yellow. But what made my blood run cold were the photographs arranged around the map. Pictures of me, of my parents, of Abigail. Surveillance photos taken without our knowledge. "He's been watching us," I whispered, showing the image to my family. "Planning something. We believe he intended to return to the cabin," Detective Scott continued. "We've set up surveillance and are monitoring all roads in the area. It's only a matter of time." But time was the one thing that seemed to stretch endlessly. Another day passed, then another. The police presence remained, but the immediate sense of danger began to fade slightly, replaced by a dull, constant anxiety that hummed beneath every moment. On the 5th day after Evan's disappearance, I decided I needed to return to my house, our house, to collect more clothing and personal items. Despite concerns from my family and cautions from Detective Scott, I insisted on going. Abigail agreed to accompany me, and an officer was assigned to escort us. The house felt different as we pulled into the driveway. No longer a home, but a crime scene. A place where memories had been irrevocably tainted. Yellow police tape still crossed the back door where forensic technicians had gathered evidence. Inside, dust had settled on surfaces, mail had accumulated on the floor beneath the mail slot, and the air felt stale and unused. I moved through the rooms like a ghost, gathering clothing and toiletries, the essential items I would need for what might be an extended absence. In Kenny's room, I paused. His dinosaur collection remained untouched on the shelves, his small bed still made with the prehistoric patterned comforter he had loved. I selected a few more items to take, his favorite books, a framed photo of him at the zoo, the small fossil kit he had been so proud of. "Take your time," Abigail said softly from the doorway. "I'll wait downstairs with Officer Reyes." Alone in Kenny's room. I sat on the edge of his bed, running my hand over the comforter. "I'm sorry," I whispered to the empty room. "I'm so sorry I didn't protect you better." The house creaked and settled around me, the familiar sounds now ominous rather than comforting. I gathered the items I had selected and placed them carefully in a duffel bag, then took one last look around the room before closing the door. As I descended the stairs, a prickling sensation ran down my spine, an instinctive awareness that something was wrong. The house was too quiet. I couldn't hear Abigail's voice or the officer's radio. "Abigail?" I called, my voice echoing slightly in the silent house. "Officer Reyes?" No response. Heart pounding, I reached the bottom of the stairs and peered into the living room. Empty. The kitchen, too. Had they stepped outside? Gone to check something in the backyard? I set down my bags and moved cautiously toward the front door, intending to look outside for them. As I passed the hall closet, the door burst open, and a hand clamped over my mouth, stifling my scream before it could fully form. Not a sound. Evan's voice hissed in my ear, his arm like an iron band, around my waist. "Your sister and that useless cop are fine, just taking a little nap in the garage. But that could change very quickly if you don't cooperate." Terror flooded through me, but beneath it, a cold fury took hold. This man, this monster, had likely killed our son, had injured my mother, and was now threatening my sister. The fear didn't disappear, but it crystallized into something harder, more focused. "What do you want?" I asked when he removed his hand from my mouth, keeping his other arm firmly around me. "What do I want?" he echoed, his voice filled with bitter amusement. "I want the life I was supposed to have, Willow. The one you ruined with your meddling and your self-righteous crusade." "You mean the life you were building with insurance money from our son's death?" I countered, unable to keep the contempt from my voice despite the danger. His grip tightened painfully. "You have no idea what I've been through, what I've sacrificed. Kenny was suffering. His condition was terminal. I just expedited the inevitable. Saved him from more pain. Saved us from financial ruin." The casual justification of his unthinkable crime made bile rise in my throat. "You murdered our child for money." "I ended his suffering," Evan insisted, his voice taking on a strange, detached quality that frightened me more than his anger had. "And now I'm going to end this nightmare you've created. We're going for a drive, Willow. Somewhere we can talk properly without interruption." Understanding dawned with terrible clarity. Evan hadn't come back for money or transportation this time. He had come back for me, to silence the one person who could ensure he never escaped justice for what he had done to Kenny. "People know I'm here," I said, struggling to keep my voice steady. "They'll come looking for me, for Abigail and Officer Reyes. Eventually, Evan agreed. But we'll be long gone by then. Now move. As he pushed me toward the back door, I realized, with grim certainty, that if I left with him now, I would never return. Whatever slim chance I had of survival lay in this house, in these moments, before he could force me into a vehicle and take me to some isolated location where my body might never be found. I had to act now, had to find some way to fight back, against the man who had already taken so much from me, for Kenny, for justice, for the future he had tried to steal from all of us. I need to use the bathroom first, I said, trying to buy time as Evan pushed me toward the back door. Nice try, he scoffed. We're leaving now. I'm serious, Evan, I insisted, forcing a note of desperation into my voice. It's been hours, unless you want me to ruin your car. He hesitated, clearly calculating the risks versus the inconvenience. Fine, 2 minutes, the downstairs bathroom only. His grip tightened on my arm. And don't get any ideas. I'll be right outside the door. The small half-bathroom off the kitchen had been Kenny's favorite, decorated with dinosaur-themed towels and a shower curtain showing prehistoric landscapes. Now it represented my only chance to find a weapon, to create a distraction, to somehow signal for help. Leave the door open, Evan ordered. I'm not using the bathroom with you watching, I protested, summoning indignation to mask my fear. After a tense standoff, he relented slightly. Crack it then, and I'm counting 120 seconds. Inside, I immediately scanned the small space for anything that might help me. The window was too small to escape through. No phone, nothing obviously useful as a weapon except my gaze fell on Kenny's dinosaur-shaped soap dispenser, a heavy ceramic triceratops that sat on the back of the toilet. I had always worried it might break if Kenny knocked it over, had almost replaced it with something lighter and plastic. Now I silently thanked whatever impulse had made me keep it. I turned on the faucet to mask any sounds, then quickly grabbed the dispenser, hefting it in my palm. It was substantial, not enough to incapacitate Evan, but enough to surprise him, to buy precious seconds. Time's up, Evan called, pushing the door wider. I swung with all my strength, aiming for his temple. Evan reacted at the last second, raising his arm defensively, but the ceramic dinosaur still connected with a sickening crack against his forearm. He howled in pain, staggering backward. I didn't wait to see if I'd broken his arm. I lunged past him, making for the front door, screaming as loudly as I could in hopes that neighbors might hear. Help! Someone help me! I'd almost reached the door when Evan tackled me from behind, sending us both crashing into the entryway table. Picture frames shattered beneath us, glass cutting into my palms as I struggled to break free. You stupid bitch, he snarled, flipping me onto my back, his hands finding my throat. You never know when to stop fighting, do you? His weight pinned me to the floor, his fingers tightening around my windpipe. Black spots appeared at the edges of my vision as I clawed at his hands, his face, anything I could reach. Kenny's face flashed in my mind, his brave smile during treatments, his excitement over simple pleasures like dinosaur documentaries and blue popsicles. Had he fought like this at the end? Had he realized in those final moments that the father he trusted was betraying him in the most fundamental way? The thought gave me renewed strength. My hand, flailing blindly, connected with something sharp. A shard from one of the broken picture frames. I grasped it tightly, ignoring the pain as it cut into my palm, and drove it upward with all my remaining strength. The glass connected with Evan's face, slicing deep across his cheek and eye. He screamed, reflexively releasing my throat to clutch at his bleeding face. I gulped in desperate breaths, shoving him off me with adrenaline-fueled strength. This time, I didn't run for the front door. I scrambled toward the kitchen, toward the garage where Abigail and Officer Reyes were presumably unconscious. If I could wake them, reach the officer's weapon or radio. I'd barely made it past the kitchen island when Evan caught up to me again, grabbing a fistful of my hair and yanking me backward with such force that I lost my footing. My head cracked against the tile floor, sending a wave of dizziness through me. "Enough!" Evan roared, blood streaming down the side of his face from the gash I'd inflicted. "I tried to make this easy for you, Willow. Quick and painless. But now? Now I'm going to make you suffer, just like you've made me suffer." He dragged me by my hair toward the kitchen, reaching for a knife block on the counter. I kicked wildly, connecting with his knee, making him stumble but not fall. His hand closed around the handle of a large chef's knife, the one he'd used countless times to prepare family meals. "You know what's funny?" he asked, his voice eerily calm despite the blood and the violence. "I actually loved Kenny, in my way. He was a good kid, but he was going to die anyway, Willow. The doctors gave him months at best. All I did was spare him more pain, more pointless treatments." "You did it for money," I gasped, still struggling to catch my breath, to clear the dizziness from my vision. "For Anna. For Hawaii." "I did it for us," he shouted, momentarily losing his unnatural composure. "For a future without debt, without the constant drain of medical bills and failed treatments. Why couldn't you just accept the insurance money? We could have started over, Willow. Together." The delusion in his words chilled me more than his violence had. He truly believed his own twisted narrative, that murdering our son had been an act of mercy, that stealing the insurance money had been for our benefit. "There is no us, Evan," I said, tasting blood where I'd bitten my lip during the fall. "There hasn't been since the moment you decided Kenny's life was worth less than money." Rage contorted his features. He raised the knife, and I knew with terrible certainty that he intended to end this now, here in the kitchen where we had once shared family breakfasts, where Kenny had finger-painted at the table while I made dinner. Closed my eyes, a strange calm settling over me. If this was the end, at least I had fought. At least I had exposed the truth about Kenny's death. At least I had tried to get justice for my son. The gunshot was so unexpected that at first I didn't recognize the sound. Thought perhaps Evan had dropped something heavy. Only when his grip on my hair suddenly released, when he collapsed beside me with a choked gasp, did I realize what had happened. Officer Reyes stood in the doorway to the garage, his service weapon still raised, his face pale but determined. Behind him, Abigail leaned against the doorframe, a nasty bruise forming on her forehead but very much conscious. "Officer Reyes?" I whispered, hardly daring to believe what I was seeing. "Are you injured, Mrs. Harrington?" he asked formally, though his voice shook slightly. He kept his weapon trained on Evan, who lay motionless on the floor beside me, blood spreading across his shoulder and chest. I don't think so," I managed, though every part of me ached, and I could feel blood trickling from cuts on my hands and face. "Abigail?" "Bastard hit us with something when we were checking the garage," she said, her words slightly slurred. "Woke up zip-tied to the pipes. Took us a while to get free." Officer Reyes approached cautiously, kicking the knife away from Evan's limp hand before kneeling to check his pulse. After a moment, he spoke into his radio, requesting immediate medical assistance and backup. "Is he—" I couldn't finish the question. "Still alive," Officer Reyes confirmed. "But in critical condition. The bullet hit near his collarbone." I should have felt something at this news. Relief, perhaps, or disappointment. Or simple shock. Instead, I felt oddly hollow, as if I had used up every emotion available to me in the desperate fight for survival. Abigail helped me to my feet, supporting me as we moved away from Evan's bleeding form. "It's over," she murmured, holding me close. "It's finally over, Willow." But was it? Even as sirens wailed in the distance, even as Officer Reyes maintained his vigilant stance over the man who had once been my husband, I knew that nothing was truly over. Kenny was still gone. The void he had left would never be filled. The betrayal Evan had committed could never be undone. The truth about how my son had died would haunt me for the rest of my life. Yet something had changed in those desperate moments of fighting for my life. The paralyzing grief that had consumed me since Kenny's death had transformed into something else. Not healed, not diminished, but somehow redirected. As if the energy of my love for him, once trapped in an endless cycle of pain, had found a new purpose. As paramedics rushed in, as Detective Scott arrived with reinforcements, as the house became a flurry of activity and evidence collection, I stood in the eye of the storm, Abigail's arm still around my shoulders, and made a silent promise to my son. I would survive this. I would find a way forward, not despite the pain, but through it. I would honor Kenny's memory not just by exposing the truth about his death, but by living the life he couldn't, with courage, with compassion, with the same bright spirit he had shown even in his darkest moments. And perhaps, someday, I would find peace again, not the peace of forgetting, but the peace of remembering without being destroyed by the memory. The weeks following Evan's arrest passed in a blur of legal procedures, medical examinations, and sleepless nights. Evan survived his injuries but faced a staggering array of charges: first-degree murder, attempted murder, assault, fraud, breaking and entering, and more. The evidence against him was overwhelming, bolstered by Paula Winter's testimony and the damning medical records showing the tampered medication. Pump! To everyone's relief, he accepted a plea deal rather than forcing a trial. Perhaps he recognized the futility of fighting the mountain of evidence, or perhaps some small remnant of humanity within him couldn't bear the public exposure of what he had done to Kenny. Either way, he pleaded guilty to all charges in exchange for life imprisonment without the possibility of parole, sparing us the additional trauma of testifying in court. In a brief victim impact statement I delivered at his sentencing, I spoke not of my own pain, but of Kenny, of the bright, brave boy whose life had been cut short by the father who should have protected him above all others. I described Kenny's love of dinosaurs, his infectious laugh, his courage during treatments, his unfailing kindness even when suffering. You didn't just take a life, I told Evan, meeting his eyes directly for the first time since the attack. You took a future, all the birthdays he'll never celebrate, all the discoveries he'll never make, all the joy he would have brought to the world. That is your true crime, and no punishment could ever be sufficient. Evan remained expressionless. Throughout, his gaze flat and empty, as if he were watching a movie that held no particular interest for him. I realized then that I would never understand him, never comprehend how the man I had married, the father who had once cradled our newborn son with tears of joy in his eyes, could have become this hollow shell devoid of remorse or human connection, as he was led away to begin his life sentence. I felt no satisfaction, no sense of justice fulfilled, only a profound weariness and the certainty that I would never see him again. The aftermath of tragedy unfolds in unexpected ways. While the criminal proceedings reached their conclusion relatively quickly, other aspects of healing proved more complicated. The insurance company, after a thorough investigation, released the policy funds to a trust in Kenny's name rather than to me directly, at my request. I couldn't bear to touch money that had been the motivation for my son's murder. Instead, I established the Kenny Parker Memorial Foundation, dedicated to supporting families of children with terminal illnesses. The foundation provided financial assistance for medical expenses, funded research into pediatric cancer treatments, and created resources to help families navigate the emotional terrain of caring for a seriously ill child. The day we launched, the foundation, 6 months after Evan's sentencing, marked the first time I felt something like purpose return to my life. Standing before a small crowd of supporters, unveiling the foundation's logo, a blue dinosaur, Kenny's favorite, I experienced A moment of clarity. This was how Kenny would live on. Not just in my memories, but in the tangible help provided to other children, other families facing the nightmare we had endured. My parents, having recovered from their physical injuries more quickly than their emotional ones, became active participants in the foundation. My father, using his background in accounting, managed the financial aspects, while my mother coordinated volunteer efforts. Abigail designed the website and handled social media outreach, her marketing skills perfectly suited to raising awareness for our cause. Even Noelle remained in our lives, having formed an unexpected bond with our family through the shared trauma of Evan's betrayal. Her relationship with her sister Anna had been irreparably damaged. Anna had fled to California after Evan's arrest, unwilling to face the consequences of her role in the tragedy. But Noelle found a new kind of family with us. The house where everything had happened, where Kenny had lived and died, where Evan had attacked me, I could not bear to keep. Yet selling it felt wrong somehow, as if I were erasing the physical space where Kenny's brief life had unfolded. After much deliberation, I found a middle path. I donated the property to a local nonprofit that converted it into a respite home for families of children undergoing long-term medical treatment. The renovation transformed the space completely. Bright colors replaced neutral tones. Walls were removed to create open, welcoming areas, and the backyard became a therapeutic garden. Kenny's room became a children's library filled with books about science and nature, with a special section devoted to dinosaurs. When the home opened, a small plaque in the entryway acknowledged its origins. In memory of Kenneth Kenny Parker, whose spirit of joy and courage lives on in this place of healing, I moved into a small apartment near my parents, needing both independence and proximity to my support system. The space was nothing like the house I had shared with Evan, deliberately so. No shared memories haunted these rooms. Here, I could begin to build something new, something that belonged solely to me. Grief, I discovered, is not a linear journey. Some days passed in relative calm, filled with purposeful work for the foundation and moments of genuine connection with family and friends. Other days, grief ambushed me without warning, triggered by a dinosaur toy glimpsed in a store window, or a small boy with Kenny's same cowlick, or simply the weight of absence that never truly lifted. On those difficult days, I developed rituals that helped me navigate the pain rather than drowning in it. I kept a journal where I wrote letters to Kenny, telling him about the foundation's work, describing how his legacy continued. I visited a small memorial garden my parents had created in their backyard, where Kenny's favorite flowers bloomed, in the spring and summer. Sometimes I simply held his dinosaur plush and allowed myself to remember the good and the terrible, the joy and the loss, all of it part of loving him. The first anniversary of Kenny's death arrived with the weight of a physical blow. I had anticipated the difficulty, had planned to spend the day with my parents and Abigail, surrounded by their love and understanding. What I hadn't expected was the package that arrived that morning, delivered by courier, with no return address. Inside was a small wooden box, beautifully crafted, with Kenny's name engraved on the lid. And within the box, nestled in velvet, lay a perfect fossil. A small dinosaur tooth, millions of years old, accompanied by a certificate of authenticity and a simple note. For Kenny's collection. From someone who understands that some treasures are irreplaceable. The handwriting was unfamiliar, the signature simply a friend. Later, I would discover that Paula Winters had arranged the gift, using her connections in the medical community to find someone who specialized in paleontology. It was her way of acknowledging the anniversary, of offering something that might bring a moment of light on a dark day. That evening, as we gathered to remember Kenny, I placed the fossil on the small memorial table alongside his photos and favorite toys. It seemed right somehow, a tangible connection to the ancient creatures he had loved, a reminder that even things lost to time can leave impressions that endure for millions of years. "He would have loved this," my mother said softly, touching the fossil with gentle fingers. "He always said he was going to be a paleontologist when he grew up." "Or a dinosaur," my father added with a sad smile. "Depending on the day." "He can be both now," I said, surprising myself with the thought. Part of the earth, part of history, part of everything. It wasn't comfort exactly. Nothing could truly comfort the loss of a child. But it was a kind of peace, fragile but real. Kenny was gone, but the love I felt for him remained, transformed but undiminished by his absence. That love had become the foundation on which I was slowly, painfully rebuilding my life. As night fell on that difficult anniversary, I stepped outside alone, looking up at the star-filled sky. Somewhere in the vastness above, a distant light that began its journey millions of years ago, perhaps when dinosaurs still walked the earth, was only now becoming visible to human eyes. The thought gave me a strange sense of connection across time and space, a reminder that nothing truly ends, it only changes form. "I love you, Kenny," I whispered to the stars. "Always and forever." And somewhere in the night, a gentle breeze stirred the leaves of the trees, carrying my words into the darkness like a promise that would never be broken. 1 year became 2, then 3. The sharp edges of grief gradually smoothed, not into absence, but into something I could carry without being cut open daily by its presence. The Kenny Parker Memorial Foundation flourished, expanding its services to include grief counseling for parents who had lost children to illness and specialized support groups for siblings dealing with loss. On what would have been Kenny's 8th birthday, we opened a dedicated wing at Memorial Hospital, the same hospital where he had received treatment. The Kenny Parker Pediatric Oncology Center featured bright, dinosaur-themed examination rooms, state-of-the-art treatment facilities, and comfortable family areas designed to make the grueling process of cancer treatment slightly more bearable for children and their families. At the ribbon-cutting ceremony, I stood flanked by my parents and Abigail, overwhelmed by how much had been accomplished in Kenny's name. Dr. Michaels, Kenny's oncologist, who had become a close ally in developing the center, spoke eloquently about the impact the new facilities would have on patient care and outcomes. "Every child who walks through these doors," she said, "will benefit from Kenny's legacy. Every family will find support during their darkest hours, because Willow refused to let tragedy have the final word." Her words touched me deeply, not because I felt deserving of praise, but because they acknowledged an essential truth. Kenny's story had not ended with his death. It continued in every child helped, every family supported, every medical advance funded by the foundation that bore his name. After the ceremony, as attendees mingled over refreshments, a young woman approached me hesitantly. Her son, about 6 years old, held her hand, his baseball cap covering what I recognized as the hair loss from chemotherapy. "Mrs. Parker?" she began. "I'm Noelle Scott. This is my son, George." I smiled at the boy, who regarded me solemnly from behind his mother's leg. "Hello, George. I like your dinosaur shoes." They were sneakers with T-Rex prints, similar to ones Kenny had loved. A shy smile broke across his face. "They light up when I walk," he demonstrated, stomping his foot to make the shoes flash. "That's very cool," I said, crouching to his level. "Do you have a favorite dinosaur?" "Triceratops," he answered immediately. "They have 3 horns to fight with." "Excellent choice." My son Kenny loved Triceratops too. The boy's mother squeezed his shoulder gently. "George has been receiving treatment here for about 6 months," she explained. "The dinosaur-themed playroom your foundation created. It's been his safe place. The only part of coming to the hospital he actually looks forward to." "I play there. Every time," George confirmed seriously. "They have all the dinosaurs, even the rare ones." "I'm so glad," I told him. That's exactly what we hoped for when we designed it. As George wandered off to inspect a display of dinosaur models set up for the event, his mother lowered her voice. I wanted to thank you personally, not just for the playroom or this amazing new center, but for the Emergency Assistance Fund. When George was diagnosed, my husband had just lost his job. The grants from your foundation helped us keep our house while he found new work. Her words reminded me why we had established that particular program. So many families faced financial devastation alongside the emotional trauma of a child's illness. The emergency fund provided stopgap assistance for mortgage payments, utilities, and other essentials to prevent families from falling into crisis while caring for a sick child. That's exactly what the fund is for, I assured her. No family should have to worry about losing their home while they're fighting for their child's life. As we talked, I learned more about George's treatment journey, the promising responses to therapy, the setbacks, the cautious optimism his doctors now expressed. It was a conversation I'd had countless times with parents connected to the foundation, yet each story remained unique, each family's courage humbling. When they eventually left, George proudly carrying a dinosaur book I'd gifted him from our display, Dr. Michaels approached with an expression that suggested she had witnessed the exchange. That boy's prognosis was very poor when he first came to us, she said quietly. Similar to Kenny's, actually. But he's responding well to a new treatment protocol our research team developed, funded in part by your foundation. The significance of her words wasn't lost on me. A child with a condition similar to Kenny's was improving, was being given a chance Kenny never had. The foundation's work wasn't just about comfort or support, it was about changing outcomes, about creating possibilities where none had existed before. Later that evening, as my family gathered at my parents' home for a private celebration of Kenny's birthday, I shared the encounter with George and his mother. We lit a candle on a small cake, chocolate with blue frosting, Kenny's favorite, and Abigail proposed a toast. To Kenny, she said, raising her glass, who continues to change lives even from beyond the stars. To Kenny, we echoed, the familiar ache of his absence mingled now with pride in what his legacy had become. After dinner, as my parents and Abigail cleared the dishes, I stepped into the backyard garden where a small stone memorial to Kenny stood among flowering plants. The evening air was cool, stars beginning to appear in the darkening sky. You would be 8 today, I said softly to the silent stone. You'd probably be too grown up for dinosaur-themed birthday parties by now, though I bet you'd still have that collection on your shelf. Talking to Kenny like this had become a ritual, not out of belief that he could literally hear me, but from a need to maintain some form of connection, to acknowledge the ongoing relationship that death had transformed but not ended. I met a boy today who reminds me of you, I continued. Same mischievous smile, same dinosaur obsession. He's getting better, Kenny. The treatment that might have saved you if it had existed then, it's helping kids like him now. A gentle breeze stirred the garden, carrying the scent of my mother's roses. In the distance, children's laughter floated from a neighboring yard where a family gathered for an evening barbecue. Life continued, all around, persistent and resilient. I'm thinking of making a change, I confided to the stone. Something I've been considering for a while now. I'm going back to school to study child psychology. The foundation work has shown me how much support children and families need during illness and loss. I want to do more than just raise money and awareness. I want to help directly. The decision had been forming gradually over months of volunteer work at the hospital, of sitting with parents as they processed devastating diagnoses or celebrated treatment milestones. I had discovered a capacity within myself, born of my own grief and healing, to be present with others in their darkest moments without being consumed by them. My parents and Abigail had enthusiastically supported the idea when I'd tentatively mentioned it to them. My mother had even found information about programs designed for adult students returning to education, with flexible schedules that would allow me to continue my foundation work while studying. As twilight deepened into night, I remained in the garden, watching the first stars appear. The past 3 years had transformed me in ways I couldn't have imagined in those first raw days of grief and betrayal. The woman who had stood at Kenny's funeral, shattered by loss and deception, was still part of me, but she was no longer all of me. "I miss you every day," I whispered to the stars that now filled the sky. "But I'm finding my way forward, Kenny, one step at a time." The path ahead wasn't clear or certain. There would still be difficult days, anniversaries that brought grief, rushing back with unexpected force, moments when Kenny's absence felt as fresh and painful as it had in the beginning. But there would also be purpose, connection, even joy, not despite having loved and lost him, but because of it. As I turned to go back inside, to rejoin my family in the warm light of my parents' home, I carried with me the certainty that Kenny's story, and mine, continued to unfold in ways neither Evan's betrayal nor death itself could diminish or erase. 5 years after opening the Kenny Parker Pediatric Oncology Center, I stood at a podium facing an audience of medical professionals, donors, and families who had been touched by our foundation's work. The occasion was the dedication of our newest initiative, a retreat facility for families of children with terminal illnesses, a peaceful place where they could create precious memories together away from hospital settings. "Today marks another milestone in our journey," I began, my voice steady with the confidence that had grown over the years of public speaking on behalf of the foundation. "The Horizon Retreat isn't just a building or a program. It's a promise that no family will face their darkest hours alone, that every child's life, no matter how brief, will be filled with as much joy and dignity as possible." From my vantage point, I could see my parents in the front row, their hair now more gray than not, but their faces bright with pride. Beside them sat Abigail with her husband and their 2-year-old daughter, named Kendall in honor of the nephew she would never meet. Even Paula Winters was present, having become an invaluable ally in our work, using her nursing expertise to help design programs that addressed families' practical and emotional needs. 10 years ago, I continued, I stood in a funeral home making arrangements for my 5-year-old son. I couldn't imagine then that anything meaningful could emerge from such devastating loss. I couldn't see beyond the pain and betrayal that had shattered the life I thought I knew. The audience was silent, respectful of the personal nature of my words. Many knew my story. It had been impossible to hide the sensational aspects of Evan's crimes and conviction, but few had heard me speak of it so directly. What I've learned in the decades since losing Kenny is that tragedy doesn't define us. Our response to it does. The path forward isn't about moving on or getting over it. It's about moving through it, about carrying our loved ones with us in the lives we continue to build. My gaze swept the room, taking in the faces of parents who understood this truth intimately, who lived it daily as they supported children through illness or carried the memory of those they had lost. The Kenny Parker Foundation began as one mother's attempt to make sense of senseless loss. Today, it stands as proof that love transcends death, that purpose can emerge from pain, that helping others is often the most healing path for ourselves. As I concluded my speech and the ceremony transitioned to a ribbon cutting, Dr. Michaels joined me at the podium. "Congratulations, Dr. Parker," she said warmly, using my recently acquired title. My return to school had culminated in a doctorate in clinical psychology with a specialization in childhood grief and trauma. "Kenny would be so proud of what you've accomplished." "Thank you," I replied, touched as always by the acknowledgement of Kenny's continuing presence in everything the foundation achieved. After the ceremony, as guests toured the new facility, a teenage boy approached me hesitantly. It took me a moment to recognize him. "George?" I asked, remembering the shy 6-year-old with the dinosaur shoes. He nodded. A healthy teenager now with no visible signs of the illness that had nearly claimed his life. My mom said I should introduce myself again. You probably don't remember me, but of course I remember you, I interrupted gently. Triceratops fan, light up shoes. How are you doing? His face broke into a surprised smile. I'm great. 5 years cancer-free now. I'm actually volunteering at the center this summer, helping in the playroom with the younger kids. The full circle moment wasn't lost on me. This boy, who had benefited from the Foundation's work during his own illness, was now giving back, extending the chain of compassion to others walking the path he had traveled. Later that evening, alone in my office at the Foundation headquarters, I sat at my desk reviewing plans for our next initiative, a specialized training program for teachers working with children returning to school after long-term medical absences. The work remained challenging but deeply fulfilling. Each new program an opportunity to honor Kenny's memory in tangible ways. My office walls held framed photographs chronicling the Foundation's growth, ribbon cuttings, fundraising events, children benefiting from our programs. Among them, in the most prominent position, hung a portrait of Kenny. Not a sad reminder of loss, but a joyful image of him laughing, surrounded by his beloved dinosaur collection. I often found myself speaking to him in quiet moments like this, sharing achievements and challenges, maintaining our connection across the divide of years and realms. We've come a long way, buddy, I said softly to his smiling image, and we're just getting started. My phone chimed with a text from Abigail. Little Kendall just pointed at Kenny's picture and said, "Dinosaur boy. She knows her cousin," I smiled, through sudden tears. Kenny lived on not just through the Foundation's work, but in the hearts and memories of our family, including the niece born years after his death. As I prepared to leave for the day, I paused before the window overlooking the city. The setting sun painted the sky in shades of orange and gold, a reminder of nature's persistent beauty even in a world that sometimes contains unimaginable pain. In that moment of reflection, I thought of all those who might be experiencing their own darkest hours, standing where I once stood, devastated by loss, betrayal, or seemingly insurmountable challenges. If I could speak directly to them, what would I say? The words formed naturally, as if I were addressing not just an imagined audience but also the woman I had been 10 years ago, broken by grief and deception. To anyone listening who feels trapped in darkness, who cannot imagine finding their way forward, I see you. I have stood where you stand. I have felt the ground disappear beneath my feet and wondered how I would survive another day, another hour, another breath. I won't tell you that time heals all wounds. Some losses leave permanent scars. I won't promise that pain disappears. It transforms, evolves, but remains part of your story. What I can tell you with absolute certainty is this: you are stronger than you know. The very love that makes loss so devastating can become your greatest source of healing and purpose. The light you think has been extinguished is still there, waiting to be rediscovered in new forms. Trust the process, even when you can't see the path. Lean on those who offer genuine support. Be patient with yourself on the difficult days, and remember that healing isn't about forgetting or moving on. It's about integration, about carrying your loved ones with you as you build a life they would be proud of. Most importantly, know that you are not alone. Others have walked this path before you and found their way to meaningful lives. Different lives than they planned, perhaps, but lives still worth living, still capable of joy and purpose and connection. This is the most profound truth I have learned. Even in our darkest moments, we remain the authors of our own stories. No betrayal, no loss, no tragedy gets to write the final chapter unless we allow it to. Your story continues. Honor the past by living fully in the present. This is how we triumph over darkness, not by escaping it, but by bringing light to it, One day, one choice, one step at a time. As the last rays of sunlight faded from my office, I gathered my things and stepped into the future that continued to unfold. A future forever shaped by Kenny's brief life and enduring legacy, by the painful lessons of betrayal, and by the healing power of purpose discovered through pain. Not an ending, but a continuing journey. Not perfection, but progress. Not the absence of grief, but its transformation into something that gave meaning rather than only taking it away. And in that transformation lay the final victory, not over death, which comes to us all, but over the despair that threatens to make us stop living before our time. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.